The weight of the gavel. Jamal Owens sat in his chambers, the soft hum of his desk lamp cutting through the quiet. The courtroom was empty now, the echoes of the day's arguments still bouncing around in his mind. Another long day. Another stack of cases that weighed heavily on his conscience. Being a judge wasn't just about interpreting the law. It was about carrying the lives of people in the balance. It was a burden Jamal carried with pride, but never without sacrifice. His rise to this seat of authority had been anything but easy. Growing up in the working-class neighborhood of Silverwood, Jamal had seen the best and worst of humanity. The community was tight-knit, but the struggles were ever-present. Opportunities were scarce, and the temptation to give in to despair was always looming. Yet even as a young boy, Jamal had an unshakable sense of purpose. Education is your way out, his late mother had always said, her voice firm but loving. She'd worked double shifts as a nurse to ensure Jamal had what he needed to succeed. Her belief in him became his guiding light. When the world doubted him, he turned her words into action. Now, as he straightened the neatly stacked files on his desk, those memories came flooding back. He had come so far, from the boy who had to fight for every opportunity to the man who held the power to shake futures with the strike of a gavel. Yet even in this position, Jamal was acutely aware of the precariousness of his success. The world had not changed as much as he had hoped. A soft chime from his phone broke his reverie. It was a text from Simone, his teenage daughter. "Dad, don't forget to check out my project tonight." Jamal smiled, the weight of the day lifting slightly. Simone was his anchor, his reason for enduring the long hours and the emotional toll. He had promised to be home in time to see her latest school project, and he intended to keep that promise. Gathering his belongings, Jamal made his way out of the courthouse. The corridors were dimly lit, the evening staff having already left for the night. As he stepped outside, the crisp night air greeted him. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few scattered cars. Jamal's sleek black sedan gleamed under the streetlights, a testament to the hard work and perseverance that had brought him to this point. The drive home was usually his time to unwind. With the radio playing soft jazz in the background, he allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The familiar streets of Silverwood rolled by, a mix of nostalgia and pride filling his heart. He had chosen to live here, despite having the means to move elsewhere. It was his way of staying connected to his roots and serving as a visible symbol of what was possible. But tonight, the drive felt different. There was a stillness in the air that he couldn't quite place. As he turned onto Maplewood Drive, the sudden flash of red and blue lights behind him shattered the calm. Jamal's heart sank. He checked his speedometer, well within the limit. His registration and insurance were up to date. There was no logical reason for him to be pulled over. Yet he knew all too well that logic often had little to do with these situations. With a deep sigh, Jamal signaled and pulled over to the curb. The patrol car stopped close behind, its headlights glaring in his rearview mirror. Years of experience had taught him how to handle moments like this. He kept his hands on the steering wheel, his movements deliberate and calm. As the officer approached, Jamal caught a glimpse of his rigid posture, his hand resting near his holstered weapon. The tension was palpable, the unspoken accusation hanging in the air. "License and registration," the officer barked, his tone devoid of politeness. Jamal nodded, his voice steady. "Of course, officer." He reached for his wallet slowly, pulling out not only his driver's license, but also his judge's badge. He handed them over, hoping the badge would de-escalate the situation. The officer glanced at the badge briefly before his expression hardened. "Step out of the vehicle," he demanded. Jamal's chest tightened. "May I ask why, officer? Have I violated any traffic laws?" "I said step out of the car," the officer repeated, his voice rising. Another officer emerged from the patrol car, standing a few feet behind his partner, arms crossed. The atmosphere grew heavier. Jamal exhaled slowly. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out, standing tall despite the unease bubbling inside him. The first officer grabbed his arm roughly, spinning him around to pat him down. Jamal clenched his jaw, but remained composed. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" the officer asked, his tone accusatory. "I live here," Jamal replied evenly. "My house is just a few blocks away. As I mentioned, I'm a judge." The officer scoffed, skepticism etched on his face. "A judge driving a car like this? We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area. You fit the description." Jamal bit back a sharp retort. He had heard this story too many times before. Instead, he raised his hands slightly, his palms open in a gesture of non-aggression. By now, a small crowd had begun to gather. Neighbors peeked out of their windows, some stepping onto their porches. The humiliation was almost unbearable. Jamal had worked tirelessly to earn the respect of his community, yet here he was, reduced to another man being treated as a suspect because of the color of his skin. The second officer ran Jamal's information through the system. When nothing incriminating came up, the frustration on the lead officer's face was evident. "Think you're above the law because you're a judge," he sneered. Jamal inhaled deeply, willing himself to remain calm. "Officer, I am fully cooperating with you. I would appreciate it if you treated me with the respect that my position and my humanity deserves." The second officer stepped closer, his hand hovering near his taser. The tension was suffocating, the situation teetering on the edge of escalation. Then, in the distance, the sound of an approaching car broke the standoff. A sleek black sedan pulled up to the scene, its government plates catching the streetlights. The door opened, and out stepped Rachel Monroe, the assistant district attorney and one of Jamal's former students. Rachel's sharp eyes surveyed the scene, her expression darkening. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado faltering. Rachel stepped forward, holding up her credentials. "This man is Judge Jamal Owens," she said, her tone icy. "What justification do you have for detaining him?" The crowd murmured in agreement, emboldened by Rachel's presence. The lead officer stammered, his confidence unraveling. "We were responding to a report of a suspicious vehicle." Rachel didn't let him finish. "And did that report include any indication that the suspect was a respected judge in this community?" she asked, her voice sharp. The officers muttered half-hearted apologies before retreating to their patrol car. As they drove away, Rachel turned to Jamal, her expression softening. "Are you okay, Judge?" Jamal nodded, though the weight of the incident lingered. "I'll be fine, Rachel. Thank you for stepping in." Rachel turned to address the crowd. "This incident highlights the very issues we need to address. Racial profiling and the abuse of authority have no place in our community." The crowd erupted in applause, their support washing over Jamal. He straightened his shoulders, a renewed sense of purpose igniting within him. This moment, painful as it was, would not define him. It would fuel his commitment to justice. As he drove home, Jamal thought about how he would share this experience with Simone. It wasn't a story he wanted to tell, but it was one she needed to hear. For her, and for everyone like her, he would keep fighting. The echoes of justice. The headlights of Jamal's car carved a path through the quiet streets as he drove toward home. The sting of the evening's encounter lingered, not as anger, but as a cold, heavy reminder of the barriers he still faced. His knuckles gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, and the familiar hum of the engine didn't bring the comfort it normally did. As he turned onto his street, Jamal slowed to a crawl. His house, a modest but welcoming two-story, stood illuminated by the soft porch light. The sight brought a flicker of warmth to his chest. Inside, his daughter Simone would be waiting, her school project undoubtedly spread across the dining table. He could already imagine her animated gestures and bright smile as she explained every detail. That thought was enough to steady him. Jamal parked and stepped out of the car, the cool night air brushing against his face. He lingered for a moment, looking up at the dark sky. Somewhere out there, his mother's words seemed to whisper back to him, reminding him of the strength he had carried all these years. When he opened the door, Simone was the first to greet him. She bounded toward him with her usual energy, her curly hair bouncing as she threw her arms around his waist. "Dad, you're home," she exclaimed, her voice filled with excitement. "You have to see what I made. It's for the science fair." Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Jamal couldn't help but smile despite the tension that still simmered under the surface. He ruffled her hair gently. "Let me get settled, and I'll be right there, okay?" Simone nodded, darting back toward the dining room where her project awaited. Jamal set his briefcase down and loosened his tie, the events of the evening beginning to fade slightly. But as he washed his hands at the kitchen sink, his reflection in the window stared back at him, a reminder that the battle was far from over. A short while later, Jamal joined Simone at the dining table. Her project was spread out in meticulous detail, colorful diagrams, neatly written notes, and a model that she had clearly spent hours perfecting. "So, what do we have here?" Jamal asked, lowering himself into the chair beside her. Simone's eyes lit up. "It's about renewable energy. I built a model of a wind turbine, and it actually works. Look." She flipped a small switch, and the tiny blades of the model began to spin, powered by a hidden battery. "That's impressive," Jamal said genuinely. "You put a lot of work into this." Simone beamed with pride. "Mrs. Carter said it could win first place. What do you think?" "I think Mrs. Carter is absolutely right," Jamal replied. "You should be very proud of yourself." As Simone began explaining the intricacies of her project, Jamal listened intently. Her voice was filled with excitement, her hands moving animatedly as she pointed to various parts of the model. For a moment, he was able to forget the encounter with the police. Here, in this moment, he was simply a father, sharing in his daughter's joy. But as Simone spoke, a question suddenly interrupted her flow of thought. "Dad, why were you late tonight?" Jamal hesitated. He had known this question would come, but he wasn't sure how to answer it. Simone was smart, too smart to accept a vague excuse, but she was also young, and he didn't want to burden her with the harsh realities of the world just yet. "I ran into a little delay on the way home," he said carefully. "Nothing for you to worry about." Simone frowned, her perceptive eyes narrowing slightly. "Was it something bad?" Jamal sighed. He couldn't lie to her, but he also didn't want to scare her. "I had an encounter with the police," he admitted. "They stopped me because they thought I was someone suspicious." Simone's face twisted in confusion. "But why? You didn't do anything wrong." "No, I didn't," Jamal said softly. "But sometimes, people make judgments about others without knowing the full story. It's not fair, but it happens." Simone's brow furrowed. "Because you're black." Jamal's heart ached at the clarity of her question. Simone was only 12, but she was already starting to understand the complexities of the world. He reached out, placing a hand gently on hers. "Yes," he said quietly. "Sometimes people judge us because of how we look. It's not right, but it's why we have to be strong. We have to show them through our actions that we are so much more than their assumptions." Simone looked down at her project, her earlier excitement replaced by a contemplative silence. "Is that why you became a judge?" she asked after a moment. Jamal smiled faintly. "That's part of it. I wanted to make sure that everyone who comes into my courtroom is treated fairly, no matter who they are or where they come from. It's not always easy, but it's important." Simone nodded slowly, her eyes thoughtful. "I want to help people too, Dad. Maybe I'll be a lawyer or a scientist who finds a way to fix things." Jamal's chest swelled with pride. "Whatever you choose to do, I know you'll make a difference. You already do." Later that evening, after Simone had gone to bed, Jamal sat in his study, his thoughts restless. The memory of the officer's skepticism, the rough grip on his arm, and the humiliation of being questioned in front of his neighbors replayed in his mind like a loop. He could have let it go, dismissed it as another unfortunate incident in a world full of them. But Jamal knew better. Change didn't happen by staying silent. Reaching for his phone, He dialed a number he hadn't called in a while. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Jamal, it's been ages. To what do I owe the pleasure?" It was Alan Rodriguez, a fellow judge and one of Jamal's closest allies in the legal community. They had worked together on several initiatives to address systemic inequality in the justice system. "Alan," Jamal began, his voice steady but firm. "I need your help. Something happened tonight, and I think it's time we do more." Alan listened intently as Jamal recounted the evening's events, his outrage evident even through the phone. "This is unacceptable," Alan said when Jamal finished. "But you're right. It's not enough to be angry. We need action." "I want to start an initiative," Jamal said. "Something that addresses racial profiling head-on. Not just in our district, but something that can set a precedent for others to follow. Training programs, community engagement, real accountability for law enforcement." Alan was silent for a moment, then said, "You know that's going to be an uphill battle, right? There will be pushback." "I know," Jamal replied, "but I can't sit by and let this happen to someone else. Not when I have the power to make a difference." Alan's voice was resolute. "Then let's do it. I'm with you." As Jamal ended the call, a sense of determination settled over him. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was no stranger to challenges. This was a fight worth taking on, for himself, for Simone, and for every person who had ever been judged unfairly. In the quiet of his study, Jamal began drafting his plan, the echoes of the day's events fueling his resolve. The fight for justice was far from over, but Jamal Owens was ready to lead the charge. A community confronts its reflection. The morning sun filtered through the blinds in Jamal Owens' study, casting long shadows over the papers strewn across his desk. The plan he had worked on deep into the night was beginning to take shape, but Jamal knew this was only the first step. A plan was nothing without action, and action meant rallying others to the cause. The events of the previous evening had ignited something within him, and he was determined to channel that energy into meaningful change. Later that day, Jamal attended a scheduled community forum at the Silverwood Civic Center. These forums were meant to be routine affairs, opportunities for local leaders to address community concerns and share updates. Today, however, the air buzzed with a different energy. Word of Jamal's encounter with the police had spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. Residents who typically remained on the sidelines had shown up in droves, their faces a mix of concern and determination. Jamal entered the hall quietly, nodding politely at the murmured greetings that followed him. The crowd hushed as he took his place at the front of the room, flanked by other community leaders, including Rachel Monroe, the assistant district attorney who had intervened during the incident. Rachel leaned toward Jamal. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, her tone laced with both encouragement and caution. "As ready as I'll ever be," Jamal replied. He stood and approached the podium, the weight of countless eyes bearing down on him. For a moment, he hesitated. Public speaking wasn't new to him, but this wasn't a courtroom. This was personal. He cleared his throat and began. "Good morning, everyone. I want to start by thanking you for being here today. Your presence speaks volumes about the strength and resilience of this community." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over the crowd. "Last night," Jamal continued, "I experienced something that many of you know all too well. Despite my position, despite the years I've spent serving this community, I was misjudged, because of the color of my skin. What happened to me is not unique, and that is precisely why we need to address it." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Jamal paused, letting the moment sink in before continuing. "This is not just my story. It's the story of countless individuals who have faced prejudice, discrimination, and injustice. It's the story of parents who worry every time their child leaves the house, of professionals who have to work twice as hard to be seen as equals, and of entire communities that bear the weight of systemic inequities." Rachel stepped forward, her voice firm as she addressed the crowd. "What happened to Judge Owens is unacceptable, but as he said, It's not unique. That's why we're here today, not just to talk about what happened, but to start taking concrete steps toward change. One hand shot up from the audience, followed by another, and soon questions and comments came flooding in. Jamal and Rachel listened carefully as residents shared their own experiences. An elderly man recounted a similar encounter from decades ago, his voice trembling with emotion. A young mother spoke tearfully about her fears for her teenage son. A local business owner expressed frustration at the lack of accountability within law enforcement. The stories were raw and powerful, each one adding to the collective call for action. Jamal took careful notes, his mind racing with ideas. The community was ready for change. They just needed a framework to channel their energy. By the time the forum ended, a clear consensus had emerged. The community wanted accountability, transparency, and proactive measures to address systemic racism. Jamal and Rachel promised to draft a proposal that would reflect the community's concerns and needs. But Jamal knew this was only the beginning. Turning ideas into action would require navigating a labyrinth of bureaucracy, resistance, and entrenched biases. That evening, as Jamal sat in his study once again, he was joined by Rachel and Alan Rodriguez. The three of them pored over the notes from the forum, brainstorming strategies and potential solutions. "We need a multi-pronged approach," Rachel said, her tone decisive. "Police training is a start, but it's not enough. We need oversight committees, data transparency, and community liaisons who can act as bridges between law enforcement and the people they serve." Alan nodded. "And we can't forget about education. This isn't just a law enforcement issue. It's a societal issue. We need programs that teach kids about diversity, empathy, and justice from an early age." Jamal leaned back in his chair, his mind already racing ahead. "I agree. But we also need to address the immediate concerns. The officers involved in last night's incident need to be held accountable. If we don't set a precedent now, how can we expect others to take this seriously?" Rachel exchanged a glance with Alan. "That's a tougher fight," she admitted. "Internal investigations often lean in favor of the officers, but if we can gather enough public support, we might be able to force their hand." Jamal's resolve hardened. "Then that's what we'll do." Over the next few weeks, Jamal and his team worked tirelessly to turn their vision into reality. They held additional forums, gathered petitions, and met with local officials to advocate for their proposals. The community rallied behind them, their collective voice growing louder with each passing day. But progress was slow, and resistance was inevitable. Some dismissed their efforts as unnecessary, arguing that the existing systems were sufficient. Others accused them of stirring up division. Jamal faced scrutiny from his peers, some of whom warned him that his activism could jeopardize his career. "You're a judge," one colleague had said during a private meeting. "You're supposed to be impartial. This could be seen as taking sides." Jamal's response was calm but firm. "Justice isn't about taking sides. It's about ensuring that the scales are balanced for everyone. If that means challenging the status quo, then so be it." The turning point came during a town hall meeting that drew hundreds of attendees, including local media. Jamal and Rachel presented their proposal in detail, a comprehensive plan that included mandatory bias training for law enforcement, an independent oversight board, and community engagement initiatives. They also called for the officers involved in Jamal's incident to issue a public apology and undergo disciplinary review. As Jamal spoke, his voice steady and unwavering, he could see the impact of his words in the faces of those around him. He spoke not just as a judge, but as a father, a neighbor, and a man who believed in the power of justice. "We are not here to sow division," he said, his gaze sweeping over the room. "We are here to build bridges, to create a community where no one has to fear being judged unfairly. This is not about blame. It's about accountability, about ensuring that our systems serve us all equally." When he finished, the room erupted into applause. It wasn't just polite or obligatory. It was a thunderous, heartfelt show of support that reverberated through the hall. For the first time in weeks, Jamal felt a glimmer of hope that real change was within reach. As the meeting concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Jamal spotted Simone in the audience, standing beside her grandmother. She gave him a small, proud smile, her eyes shining with admiration. In that moment, Jamal knew that every sleepless night, every difficult conversation, and every ounce of effort had been worth it. The road ahead would still be challenging, but he was ready to face it, not just for himself, but for Simone, for Silverwood, and for every person who deserved to live in a world where justice wasn't just an ideal, it was a reality. The resistance and the reckoning. The momentum from the town hall meeting carried Jamal and his team forward. Articles about their initiative began appearing in local newspapers, and community members reached out to express their support. But with progress came pushback. The louder their voices grew, the harder some factions worked to drown them out. It started subtly, with anonymous emails and social media comments dismissing their efforts as unnecessary. Not all cops are bad, some argued. Others claimed that focusing on racial profiling was divisive, and that the community should instead move on from the issue. Jamal ignored the noise, focusing instead on the tangible changes they were fighting for. But as the initiative gained traction, the resistance became more direct. One evening, as Jamal arrived at the courthouse, he found a note taped to his office door. The message was scrawled in thick black marker. "Stay in your lane, Judge." Jamal stared at the note for a long moment, his heart sinking. He wasn't naive. He had expected backlash. But seeing the threat in writing made the stakes feel even higher. Taking a deep breath, he crumpled the note and threw it away. He wouldn't let intimidation derail him. The next day, Jamal met with Rachel and Alan to discuss the growing resistance. Rachel's expression darkened as Jamal recounted the note. "This is exactly why we need to keep pushing," Rachel said firmly. "The fact that people are resorting to threats shows how much they fear change." Alan nodded in agreement, "But we need to be careful. These kinds of threats can escalate. We should inform the authorities." Jamal hesitated. Reporting the note felt like drawing more attention to himself, but he knew Alan was right. "I'll file a report," he said, "but let's not lose focus. The work we're doing is too important to be sidetracked." The team spent the rest of the meeting refining their proposal. They had secured enough signatures for their petition, and the next step was presenting it to the city council. It was a critical juncture. If the council approved their plan, it would set a powerful precedent. But convincing the council was far from guaranteed. As the date of the council meeting approached, the tension in the air grew palpable. The police department issued a statement defending their officers, claiming that the incident involving Jamal was a misunderstanding. The statement stopped short of an apology, and instead emphasized the challenges officers face in high-pressure situations. The statement ignited a firestorm of debate. Supporters of the initiative criticized the department for failing to acknowledge systemic issues, while opponents doubled down on their claims that the initiative was anti-police. Jamal found himself in the center of the storm, his every move scrutinized. One evening, as Jamal reviewed his notes for the council meeting, Simone entered his study. She held a plate of cookies in one hand and a notebook in the other. "Thought you could use a snack," she said, placing the plate on his desk. Jamal smiled. "Thanks, sweetheart. What's the notebook for?" Simone hesitated, then held it out to him. "I wrote something. For the meeting." Curious, Jamal opened the notebook. Inside was a short speech, written in Simone's neat handwriting. As he read, his throat tightened. The speech was simple but powerful, expressing her pride in her father and her hope for a future where no one had to experience what he did. "This is beautiful, Simone," Jamal said, his voice thick with emotion. "But are you sure you want to speak at the meeting? It's going to be intense." Simone nodded, her eyes steady. "I want to help. People need to know how this affects us, not just you." Jamal pulled her into a hug, his heart swelling with pride. "You're incredible, you know that." Simone grinned. "I get it from you." The day of the council meeting arrived, and the tension in the room was palpable. The chamber was packed, with residents filling every seat and spilling into the aisles. News cameras lined the back wall, their lenses trained on the speaker's podium. Jamal sat in the front row, flanked by Rachel and Alan. Simone sat beside him, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. As the meeting began, the council members listened to a series of prepared statements from both sides. Opponents of the initiative argued that it unfairly targeted law enforcement and would create unnecessary bureaucracy. Supporters countered with stories of their own experiences, emphasizing the urgent need for change. When it was Jamal's turn to speak, the room fell silent. He approached the podium with measured steps, his mind focused and clear. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady. "My name is Judge Jamal Owens, and I am here not just as a member of this community, but as a father, a neighbor, and someone who believes in justice for all." He recounted the events of the night he was stopped by the police, his words careful and precise. He didn't speak with anger, but with a quiet determination that resonated throughout the room. "This initiative is not about blaming individuals," Jamal continued. "It's about addressing the system that has allowed prejudice to persist for far too long. It's about ensuring that every person, regardless of their race or background, is treated with dignity and respect." The room erupted into applause as Jamal stepped back. He returned to his seat, his heart pounding. He glanced at Simone, who gave him a reassuring nod before standing to take her turn at the podium. As Simone began speaking, Jamal felt a swell of pride and a tinge of nervousness. Her voice was clear and unwavering, her words echoing the hope and resilience that Jamal had worked so hard to instill in her. "My dad has taught me that being brave isn't about not being scared," Simone said, her voice carrying across the room. "It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. That's why we're here today, to make sure everyone gets treated fairly. Because that's what justice is supposed to be." The audience erupted into applause once again, some people even standing to cheer. Jamal blinked back tears as Simone returned to her seat, her small hand reaching for his. The council deliberated late into the night, and the tension in the room was almost unbearable. Finally, the council president announced their decision. The initiative was approved. The room erupted in cheers, the sound overwhelming. Jamal exhaled deeply, the weight of weeks of effort and uncertainty finally lifting. He turned to Simone, who was beaming with pride. "You did it, Dad," she said, her voice filled with joy. "No," Jamal replied, pulling her into a hug. "We did it." The victory was just the beginning. The approved initiative laid the groundwork for systemic change, but Jamal knew the real work was only just starting. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But as he stood in the chamber, surrounded by the people who had fought alongside him, Jamal felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in a long time, he felt not just the weight of the gavel, but the power of the community behind him. Together, they would continue the fight for justice, and they would not stop until it was won. The ripple effect. The days following the council meeting were a whirlwind. News outlets from the local level to national networks picked up the story of the initiative, dubbing it the Silverwood Justice Reform Plan. Jamal's encounter with the police became the catalyst for a broader conversation about racial profiling and systemic reform. He hadn't anticipated the scope of the response, but it was clear. Silverwood had become a symbol of hope and resistance. Jamal stood in his study, gazing at the neatly framed photo of his late mother on his desk. Her eyes, captured in a moment of quiet strength, seemed to watch over him. He imagined how proud she would have been, knowing that her son had turned the struggles of their past into a movement for justice. But pride was not the same as complacency. Jamal knew this was not a time to rest on laurels. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from Rachel. "We're seeing some resistance at the implementation level. Police union reps are pushing back hard. Meeting at City Hall tomorrow. Need your input." Jamal frowned, the familiar tension creeping into his chest. Resistance was expected, but the union's involvement added a layer of complexity. Their influence could stall, or even derail, the progress they had fought so hard to achieve. He typed a quick response. "I'll be there. Let's strategize before the meeting." The next morning, Jamal joined Rachel and Alan at City Hall. They convened in a small conference room, their faces grim as they reviewed the latest developments. "The union is framing this as an attack on law enforcement," Rachel explained, gesturing to a printed copy of the union's official statement. "They're claiming the initiative will demoralize officers and make it harder for them to do their jobs." Alan leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "They're playing the fear card. It's a tactic we've seen before. But if we can prove that the initiative strengthens, rather than undermines, community trust, we might have a chance to counter their narrative." Jamal nodded, his mind already racing. "We need data. If we can present concrete evidence showing that similar reforms in other cities have led to improved outcomes, both for officers and the community, we can undercut their argument." Rachel tapped her pen against her notebook. "I'll reach out to my contacts in those cities and pull the numbers. But we'll also need testimonials, stories from residents, and even officers who support the initiative." Jamal hesitated. "Do you think we can find officers willing to speak up? There's a lot of pressure to toe the union line." Rachel gave him a determined look. "If we can't, we'll find retired officers who've seen the benefits of reform. One way or another, we'll get the voices we need." As they worked, the challenges mounted. The police union organized a rally outside City Hall, drawing a crowd of officers and their supporters. Signs with slogans like "Support our police" and "No to anti-cop policies" were raised high, the chants echoing through the streets. Media coverage of the rally painted a stark picture of the growing divide. Inside, Jamal and his team prepared for the public hearing where the next phase of the initiative would be debated. The stakes were higher now, and the opposition more vocal, but the community's support remained strong. When the day of the hearing arrived, the council chamber was packed once again. This time, however, the atmosphere was more contentious. Rows of officers in uniform filled one side of the room, their faces stoic. On the other side sat residents and activists who supported the initiative. The divide was literal and symbolic, a visual representation of the battle ahead. Jamal was the first to speak. He approached the podium with the same calm confidence he had displayed during the council meeting. But this time, the stakes felt even greater. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady. "I want to start by acknowledging the invaluable role that law enforcement plays in our community. The men and women who serve as officers face challenges that many of us cannot imagine. But acknowledging that does not mean ignoring the reality of systemic issues that undermine trust between officers and the communities they serve." He paused, scanning the room. "This initiative is not an attack on law enforcement. It is an effort to build bridges, to ensure that every person, officer and civilian alike, is treated with respect and dignity. It is about accountability, fairness, and trust." Jamal's words were met with a mix of applause and murmurs of dissent. Undeterred, he continued, presenting the data Rachel had gathered and sharing stories from community members who had suffered from racial profiling. His arguments were logical, impassioned, and impossible to ignore. Then came the opposition's turn. A union representative stepped forward, his tone combative as he argued that the initiative unfairly targeted officers and would lead to decreased morale and increased crime. Jamal listened carefully, noting the points that needed to be addressed. When it was time for rebuttals, he stood again. "I hear your concerns," he said, addressing the officers directly. "And I understand that change can be difficult. But let me ask you this. How can we expect officers to do their jobs effectively if the communities they serve do not trust them? This initiative is not about weakening law enforcement. It's about strengthening it by ensuring that trust is earned and maintained." As the hearing progressed, emotions ran high. One of the most powerful moments came when a retired police captain, a black man named Charles Daniels, stepped forward to speak. "I served on the force for 30 years, Captain Daniels began, his voice firm but emotional. And I've seen firsthand the damage that unchecked bias can do, not just to the community, but to the officers themselves. Good officers want accountability because they know it makes the job safer for everyone. This initiative is not anti-police, it's pro-justice. Captain Daniel's testimony drew a standing ovation from the supporters' side of the room, and even a few officers nodded in agreement. His words carried weight, offering a bridge between the two sides. By the end of the hearing, the room was charged with tension and hope. The council announced that a final vote on the initiative would be held in 2 weeks, giving both sides time to mobilize. In the days that followed, Jamal's resolve was tested repeatedly. The opposition intensified their efforts, launching a campaign to sway public opinion. But Jamal's team fought back just as hard, organizing rallies, releasing testimonials, and engaging with the community at every opportunity. The night before the vote, Jamal sat in his study, reflecting on the journey so far. Simone entered the room, holding a cup of tea. "You've been working so hard," she said, setting the tea down. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" Jamal smiled, his eyes tired but warm. "A little, but mostly, I'm hopeful. No matter what happens, we've started something important. And that's what matters." Simone nodded, her admiration for her father evident. "You're making a difference, Dad. I'm proud of you." Jamal pulled her into a hug, her words a balm for his weary soul. "Thank you, sweetheart. That means more than you know." The next day, as Jamal entered the council chamber for the vote, he felt the weight of the moment. The room was filled with anticipation, the air electric. Whatever the outcome, Jamal knew that this was just the beginning. The fight for justice was a marathon, not a sprint, and he was ready to keep running, no matter how long it took. The vote and the aftermath. The council chamber was alive with tension as the final vote on the Silverwood Justice Reform Plan approached. The air was thick with anticipation, every seat occupied, and the aisles filled with standing attendees. On one side sat the officers and their union representatives, their faces resolute. On the other side were community members, activists, and families who had fought tirelessly for the initiative. Jamal Owens stood among them, his face calm but his hands clasped tightly in front of him. As the council president called the session to order, the room fell silent. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest. This vote wasn't just about policy. It was about a vision for the future, a step toward a more just and equitable system. But he knew that not everyone in the room saw it that way. The council members began their deliberations, each one taking turns to voice their positions. Some spoke passionately in favor of the initiative, emphasizing the importance of accountability and trust in law enforcement. Others raised concerns about the potential impact on officer morale and the feasibility of implementing such sweeping reforms. "I want to be clear," one council member said, addressing the room. "This initiative is not about punishing our police force. It's about making sure that every member of our community feels safe and respected. And that includes our officers." But not all the voices were supportive. One council member, a staunch ally of the police union, argued that the initiative was unnecessary and would create division in the community. "We need to support our officers, not burden them with additional oversight," she said. Her words drew scattered applause from the opposition side of the room. Jamal listened intently, his expression neutral. He had prepared himself for resistance, but the sting of their arguments still lingered. He glanced at Simone, who sat beside him, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. She gave him a small, reassuring smile. Finally, it was time for the vote. The council president called each member by name, their votes recorded one by one. The room was so silent that every aye or nay seemed to echo like a thunderclap. Aye, nay, aye, nay. The votes were evenly split as they approached the final member. The council president, an experienced and pragmatic leader, was the tiebreaker. She paused, glancing at the packed room, the weight of the decision visible on her face. "I vote aye," she said, her voice firm. For a moment, the room was silent as the words sank in. Then, The supporters erupted into cheers, their applause and shouts of relief filling the chamber. Jamal exhaled deeply, a wave of emotion washing over him. He turned to Simone, who threw her arms around him. "You did it, Dad," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "No," Jamal replied, his voice thick with emotion. "We did it." The victory was monumental, but the work was far from over. Implementing the reforms outlined in the initiative would require dedication, collaboration, and perseverance. Jamal and his team immediately began coordinating with city officials, community leaders, and even some willing members of the police force to ensure the changes were rolled out effectively. Over the next few months, Silverwood began to transform. The mandatory bias training sessions for law enforcement were met with mixed reactions, but as they progressed, many officers admitted that the training gave them new perspectives. Community oversight boards were established, providing a platform for residents to voice their concerns and work directly with law enforcement to address issues. One of the most impactful changes was the introduction of a community liaison program. Officers were paired with residents to build relationships and foster trust. Simone even volunteered as a youth representative on one of the committees, inspired by her father's example. Despite the progress, challenges persisted. Some officers resigned in protest, and the police union continued to voice opposition to certain aspects of the reforms. Jamal faced criticism from detractors who accused him of undermining law enforcement. But he also received messages of support from across the country, from individuals and communities inspired by Silverwood's efforts. One day, as Jamal reviewed reports on the initiative's early successes, he received a letter from an unexpected source. Officer Brent Thomas, the lead officer who had stopped him that night on Maplewood Drive. Jamal hesitated before opening it, unsure of what to expect. The letter was short but sincere. "Judge Owens, I've been reflecting on that night and what happened afterward. At first, I was defensive, convinced I had done nothing wrong. But the training sessions made me realize how my assumptions clouded my judgment. I want to apologize for the way I treated you. I hope we can both move forward in a better direction. Respectfully, Officer Brent Thomas." Jamal set the letter down, his emotions a mix of surprise and cautious optimism. It wasn't often that people admitted their mistakes, and while an apology couldn't erase the past, it was a step toward healing. Months turned into a year, and Silverwood became a model for other communities. The initiative's success inspired similar efforts in neighboring cities, and Jamal was invited to speak at conferences and forums about the importance of systemic reform. His story, and Silverwood's transformation, became a beacon of hope for others facing similar challenges. Simone's involvement in the community continued to grow. She helped organize youth forums to discuss issues of justice and equality, and her school project on renewable energy won first place at the science fair. Jamal couldn't have been prouder of her. One evening, as the sun set over Silverwood, Jamal and Simone sat on their porch, watching the neighborhood come alive with laughter and conversation. The changes were tangible, not just in policy, but in the renewed sense of unity and purpose that had taken root in the community. "Do you think Grandma would be proud of us?" Simone asked, her voice thoughtful. Jamal smiled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I think she'd be proud of all of us," he said. "This isn't just about what we've done. It's about what we're building. And it's only the beginning." As the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, Jamal felt a quiet sense of peace. The road ahead would still have challenges, but he knew they would face them together. And for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful, not just for Silverwood, but for the future.